Okay, regarding Naja too, you told
Yeah.
me the it's a movie that has taken the highest top box office gross movies of all time, the top 10 now, which is the only non-Hollywood movie. So, and of course the media in the West is saying, oh, it's entirely because of the Chinese market. Well,
Yeah.
Avatar, Titanic, Star Wars, they were all allowed into China. Okay, they
Yeah.
were people were watching them. So it's not like those
Mm.
movies were not allowed and only this one
Yeah.
is in China. So anyway,
Mm.
but you're telling me that it's not showing in any European movies theaters except in Greece, right?
Correct. Correct.
And and the reason is, do you know? I mean, what?
Well, I won't. I mean, there's been no I mean, there's been hardly any public discussion of this film. I
Mhm,
mean, it's not as if most people in Britain or France or Germany even know it exists. I mean, of course, a
yeah.
lot of people do because I mean, people learn about it on the internet and things of that
Hmm.
kind. But I mean, it's not something that you read about in the media. There'd be no big reviews about it or anything of that kind. Um, the reason um, Chinese films are not widely shown in European cinemas. And this, I, by the way, have knowledge of because I have
Hmm.
background in it. My brother, for a very, very long time, was secretary of the Script Writers Guild of
Hmm.
Great Britain, the people who write the scripts of the films. So through him, I got to know an awful lot about the way the European cinema industry is organized. The way it is organized is that all the film distribution is basically owned by the big Hollywood studios. I mean, they control the television, sorry, the cinemas, the streaming mechanisms, all of those things. You know, the well-known streaming ones, and of course Netflix and all of that operate, and they are structured to promote American films. The
Hmm.
only country which previously had stood out against this was France, where there was legislation that required French cinemas to devote 50% of their time, 50% of their
Hmm.
movie time to showing French films. I believe that's gone, by the way, but it
Okay.
did mean that France did have a big film industry by comparison with all the other European countries. Now, every European country has a film industry of a kind, but it's very
Hmm.
small and it
Yeah.
operates on very limited way. And of course, films from China and other places, especially from China, which is a huge film
Hmm.
industry, find it very difficult as a result to break through into the European market. In the United States, it is easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in America, these films are shown, and the reason is that American studios, the big studios, want to show their films in China. So
Uh-huh.
they're
Okay.
worried that if they stop,
Hmm.
they disallow the showing of Chinese films in the United States, they won't be able to show their films
Hmm.
in China. So
Hmm.
this is why it's easier to see Chinese films in the
Yeah.
United States than it is in Europe. But that's basically the reason. Now, it's not because Europeans are not interested in Chinese films.
Hmm.
They most emphatically are. Um, in I there was a time when you could actually see Chinese films in Britain. I remember them.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, these are old films now. You know, Yellow Earth and
Uh-huh.
Raise the Red Lantern and things like that. You actually could find them in you know, normal cinemas,
Hmm.
but you don't anymore because as the Chinese film industry has developed and grown in scale, it's now come to be seen as a challenge to Hollywood. So, of
Hmm.
course, it must be excluded. And a film like Neja 2, which has the potential to reach a mass audience,
Hmm.
is probably seen as a particular is probably seen as a particular threat.
Everything about China is a threat. Whatever.
Everything about China is a threat. We are being brought up. We are being brought up in such a ridiculous and nonsensical way that it is just beyond belief. When I was a child in the 60s, and I came to Britain, well, I remember going with my father to the cinema, and we actually saw what was it called? It was a Chinese film that was based in an animation film made in the 1960s, Uproar in Heaven, which
Okay.
is
Uh-huh.
based on Monkey.
Yeah, yeah.
And this was shown quite openly in
Hmm.
British cinemas at that time, and I remember being absolutely dazzled by it. That was in the 60s, but today we can't watch Chinese animation.
Britain in particular, because there are many British movies and TV series
Yeah,
in China, very
yeah,
popular.
yeah,
Downtown, that TV series.
yeah,
And then I think The Crown is now
mm,
showing. I'm not
mm.
sure, but if it's not showing, it's going to be shown. China is pretty open to all these,
Yeah, and
speaking.
you will not see a single Chinese drama on British television. I mean, it never happens.
Well, but why is Greece allows? Greece is the only
Right.
country I can see, right? So,
Yeah, Greece is very different because, and perhaps to some extent, this reflects my own person, my
mm,
background as well. I mean, Greeks have a particular affinity for China and
mhm,
an interest in China. Now, partly it is because to be completely honest about this, we don't feel ourselves to be completely European. I mean, we are at the very eastern end of Europe.
mhm,
We're also part of the Mediterranean world.
Mediterranean.
We have slightly different attitudes, to say the attitudes you find in Germany and Britain and France and those
Mhm,
sort of countries. But we are also the oldest continuous civilization in Europe, about which we are very, very conscious. And we are very, very conscious that alongside our civilization, there was the great civilization that existed in China. And I mean, my father, for example, was extremely interested in China. He went there several times. He was invited by the Chinese government. He was
mhm.
hosted at Dayutai guest house and met all
Okay.
sorts of
Yeah, okay.
people there. So all of that. So and he's typical of the attitudes of many. He was typical of the attitudes of many people in Greece. So there will be demand in Greece for Chinese films and access to Chinese culture in ways that you will not find elsewhere in Europe. I mean, it'd be very, very difficult to persuade Greeks, in fact, impossible to persuade Greeks, that China is any kind of cultural threat or anything of that sort.
Um, we talked about Yanis Varoufakis, right? That
Mm,
you personally know. He
mm,
actually at one point, he said, now you mentioned many times the Russians think Chinese are very hard negotiators, right?
yeah.
But Yanis, he actually said the Chinese are very easygoing if you listen to
Yes.
him when when they negotiated with Greece. So Greece and China has a pretty special relationship,
Yeah.
I would say, isn't it?
Yes, it's absolutely true. I mean, I had experience. I mean, I was never with him, but I
Hmm.
remember my father coming back and him telling me that just as Greeks are interested in Chinese culture and Chinese history,
Hmm.
the Chinese were very interested in Greek culture and Greek
Hmm.
history because, again, they had this sense that this is an old civilization like their own, and that they have a connection. I remember him telling me very emotionally
Hmm.
about how there was this picture in one of the tombs of the Tang dynasty close
Hmm.
to Xi'an, in
Hmm.
which you saw the ambassadors from the Emperor of Byzantium, who was, of course, Greek,
Hmm.
coming to the court, to the Tang court, at the time
Hmm.
of Empress, uh, um, the Empress Wu Zetian.
Hmm.
So he was very, very moved by that. I mean, so that that there is this long history of contact and this long history of interest between China and Greece, and uh, he did tell me that there was this very great goodwill from China towards Greece. Um, I've heard, I mean, I have to say this also, that I've heard that at the level of commercial contacts,
Hmm.
the Chinese have learned that if you deal with Greek ship owners and business people, you have to be extremely careful and take a very, very, very tough line. And those sort of people who will take advantage at the least opportunity. I say this, I mean, that is again part of our tradition. They do find it. They do find that the attitude to them from the Chinese can be a little bit more, shall we say, tough than Greek cultural ambassadors or economics people or ministers, government ministers should be. I have to qualify all of this by saying that the Greek government, the current Greek government, has very, very little real interest in China. And it is a matter of great distress to many people in Greece. And again, I happen, well, I don't know him very well, but I do partly know a senior diplomat in the Greek Foreign Office, Foreign Ministry, who's responsible for relations with Asia, including China. And he told me what his budget was, and I was profoundly shocked. And he was telling me that it's very, very difficult to get the Prime Minister, the Greek Prime Minister, to take an interest in China, and that he's always focused on America and what the Americans are doing.
Well, that's very unfortunate because
Yes.
in China, there's a lot of goodwill, actually not just the government level, but even regular people. Now, do you aware of what happened to Varyag, the aircraft carrier from Ukraine? Have you heard about that?
Oh yes, absolutely. That it came to didn't the Chinese they rebuilt it and it became a Chinese one, yes.
Yes.
And they learned some things from it and they built much better aircraft carriers than that one. But anyway, carry on, carry on.
Well, I think that the whole
Yeah.
experience really solidified the relationship between Greece and China. Just so for my audience who don't know the story, right? So Varyag is a Ukraine aircraft carrier that wasn't finished. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they couldn't continue. I think they built it 2/3 of it, and they couldn't continue to build it because they ran out of money. Not only they can't continue, but they can't even keep it because keeping it is costs a lot of money, apparently. So they were looking for a buyer. Now, of course, China at the time didn't have aircraft carrier, so China was interested. The US was extremely alerted. Now, what China did was they had a person who called himself a casino guy. He said, okay, I want to refurbish this thing into a floating hotel and casino outside Macau. So that was his motive to buy this. The US immediately sent people telling Ukrainians, be very careful. So, but at the time, Ukrainians need money. So eventually, US couldn't stop the sale, but told the Ukrainians to strip the whole thing. So it is but basically just an empty shell. But even that, okay, so that is finished. Eventually, I think that at the time they paid 20 million or something. So that itself took a lot of effort. So finally, China got it. I mean, this guy got it. And they got to want to sail through the Bosporus. And the Turkey said no. Turkey said no. This is an unusual carrier, aircraft carrier. It will danger everybody else. You need to give a security deposit for $1 billion. This was in 2000, I think. 1 billion. It's extortion. I mean, everybody could see that's an extortion, and nobody believed that the Turkey would return that money.
No.
So there was back and forth and back and forth. Eventually, Turkey, I think, relented because it looked so bad. It is extortion. Everybody can see this is extortion. So eventually, Turkey said, okay, if you can find a EU or NATO member that can guarantee, we will let you go.
Yeah.
That's when Greece came in and said, we could do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting.
And I think both the Turkey and probably even American was a little bit surprised by that.
Yeah.
That Greece did that to help China.
Yeah.
And not only that, I think the tugboat, because the aircraft carrier couldn't really sail, it's not finished, right? So there was a tugboat company was pulling the whole carrier back to China. And during that process also was very dramatic. It was really bad weather at some point. So the cables connecting the two boats was broken. And so they have to rescue the whole thing in a very, very dire conditions. And during the process, I think one of the sailors was killed. I'm not sure the sailor was, I think the sailor was either a Dutch or a Norwegian, but the
Mm,
company, the tugboat company, was a Greece company.
mm,
So you
mm.
see, in this whole process, Greece really helped China tremendously
Right.
process.
Yeah.
And I think this thing really, because in the end, this thing, China refurbished it, and this is the China's first aircraft carrier called Liaoning. And for this matter, I think a lot of Chinese forever
Yeah.
grateful
Yeah.
for
Well,
Greece.
as I said, that attitude reflects still the attitudes of the Greek people. The Greek people are very, very friendly towards China. If you
Hmm.
go to Greece, you will not find a population, a more China-friendly population than you will find in Greece. I can say that absolutely. As I said, we have a different perspective on these things from other European countries. I mean, there isn't this fear and whatever
Yeah.
it is about China. There isn't the same fear about Russia either, by the way,
Mhm.
just to say. But we're a small country. We can only do so much. And of course, our political system is very controlled and locked down. In 2000, this would have been before the financial crisis,
Hmm.
when Greece basically went bankrupt. The control of the country was taken over by Germany and Brussels,
Hmm.
and when the whole political system essentially was completely recalibrated into a much more pro-Western, pro-Preston direction. But the attitude of the people has not changed.
And that's also, I think you can see why Turkey and China just always have a little bit
Yeah.
dispute, because on this matter, I just don't see why Turkey is doing something like that, other than distorting money. I mean, it,
I'll tell you straightforwardly because again, I know Turkey. It was that billion. You're absolutely right. The billion, whatever it was, would not have, and probably the Greek guarantee, which, if it had been breached, would have involved Turkey in a
uh-huh,
dispute with the European Union, because, of course,
okay.
it was a different politics in those days. That probably deterred the Turkey. But you're absolutely right. If China had just put up that deposit, it would never have seen its money again. And of course, it would have gone straight into the accounts of all sorts of important people in Turkey, including people of the Turkish government, friends of the then prime minister, who was, I think, if not yet Mr. Erdogan, Mr.
Yeah.
Erdogan's friends.
Hmm.
Anyway, would have that's what would have happened.
Yeah.
Turkey, there's a lot to be said about Turkey, and I don't want to always sound critical about Turkey because a lot of interesting and good things happen. But I mean, the corruption is there, and it
Hmm.
does work in all sorts of interesting ways. And this sounds to me exactly like that. Looking at China, you know that it's got deep pockets, so you want to help yourself to some of the money inside the pockets. That's basically what it looked like. What it looks like to me, knowing Turkey.
Yeah. But it doesn't make Turkey look good, right? Because
No, of course not.
you
It's
control,
terrible.
yeah, you
Yeah,
control a very crucial parts of the sea, sea route, and then you take advantage of that. That's
yeah,
just definition of
yeah.
extortion, robbery.
It is exactly correct. But I mean, if you look at Turkish foreign policy, you can see the way it plays out all the time. I mean, look at the way they've just overthrown the government in Syria. They've installed a new government in Syria. This whole thing was about driving the Russians out. Now
Mhm.
suddenly
Yeah.
they want the Russians to stay. They telephone the Russians. They get this new leader to telephone the Russians
Mhm.
and say, well, you can have your bases, only give me lots and lots and lots of money, and you get a kind of trade being done. This is, I'm afraid, how Turkey works.
Yeah.
It's how it conducts its relations. It always takes a very, shall we say, hard-nosed, tough bargaining approach. And I'm afraid scruples and morals and consistency and principle have very little
Mhm.
role to play.